Good, thank you very much. You'd be forgiven for thinking that every article we read about hearing mentions dementia, because it almost does. And what I'm going to suggest this afternoon is we might have gone down a rabbit hole and it might be hard to dig back out of it. So we're going to look at why that's the case and the evidence. Is there evidence that hearing loss causes dementia? Is there evidence that hearing aids reduce the chance of dementia? So that's going to be the topic this afternoon. Comes from Lewis Carroll, of course, going down a rabbit hole, meaning that you've gone off somewhere you didn't mean to go to, and that you've... Actually, I'll just, at this point, I might just put my glasses on. That's a little screen down there. Actually, it's still little. Let me stand in. Let me stand in front of it. Actually, if you don't mind, I'll stand down here so I can see the bigger screen. Okay, so it all comes from Lewis Carroll. Alice follows the rabbit down the hole, ends up in Wonderland. But it's really used to describe something that receives maybe the attention that it doesn't deserve. And that's the point that I'm going to share with you this afternoon and see if you agree or don't agree. And I'm going to split the presentation into 4 parts. And the first part is this one, which for a Saturday afternoon sounds rather complicated, but I'm going to talk us through it because this is absolutely vital. If we get this bit right, it will help our understanding as we go forward. So we're going to explain what is a potentially modifiable personal risk factor, right? I'll break it down in just a minute, but it's absolutely vital. If we get this right, you're on to a winner. And then we'll move on to the other point. So let's just start with the first one. The attention really for the link between hearing loss and dementia stems from these Lancet articles. First one was in 2017, and then it was updated in 2020. Livingston, another, based at UCL. And in these articles, this figure, this kind of stream appears. I've taken this one from the 2020 version because it's been revised a little bit. And essentially what it's saying is, it's the lifespan. We start at the top, and there are things that can happen along the way that can increase our risk of dementia. And there are 12 factors listed on this slide. And most of them have a percentage attached to them. It's round about 2, 3, 4%, except for hearing loss and depression, which are up at 8 or 9%. So they stand out as being different from all the other risk factors. And I want to just explain, what does this slide mean? Because it's not talking about our personal risk. When you see it written, like we have an 8 or 9, if we have a hearing loss, we have an 8 or 9% increased risk of dementia. That's wrong, that's completely wrong. What this is saying is 8 or 9% of people in the world, their dementia is associated with hearing loss. It's not even saying the hearing loss causes it, it's saying it's associated with it. So when we see this 8% or whatever, it's nothing to do with the risk to you or me, which actually is what we're interested in, right? What's the risk to me that I'm going to get diabetes? What's the risk to me for heart disease? What's the risk to me? So we're going to come on to the personal risk. But this is the figure that's used most of the time. And it's really saying, what are the number of people in the world that we're saying hearing loss is the factor, that if it was causing it, if we removed it, it would reduce it. So it's really saying, if hearing loss is shown to cause dementia, if we could avoid hearing loss, if we could address hearing loss and get everyone to wear hearing aids all of the time, everyone who needs one, that potentially could reduce it by 8 or 9%. Tall order. Here is the personal risk. So if you go through the document, you'll find a table, and it says, here's the personal risk for a variety of different factors, and it's a ratio. So 1 means if you didn't have that factor, your risk would be 1. A number greater than 1 means you have a higher risk. So if you look at this table, I've ranked them, and I've ranked them according to, oh, be careful here, the 2020 Lancet article. And you'll see at the top, hearing loss 1.9, dementia 1.9. And then it goes all the way down to, at the bottom, we have air pollution 1.1%. There's a variety of factors listed there. One of them is education. Why would poor education put you at an increased risk of dementia? Poor education, it's a bit like running a marathon. If you train regularly, you've got lots of resources, and you might make it across the finishing line. If you've had a poor education and you've got limited cognitive abilities to start with, you don't really have very much in reserve to finish the race. That's why poor education is a risk factor. Just this year, the figures have been revised. 1.9 was the top one, wasn't it? I'll explain in layman's terms in a minute, what does that actually mean, the risk to you? That 1.9 has been revised because there have been many more studies published, and it's come down to 1.35. If you put things in order now, you'll see actually it puts hearing loss down towards the bottom of these 12 risk factors. The latest evidence, with more studies, puts the personal risk still above 1, but 1.35. But it's no longer at the top of the list there. So here's how we use these risk factors. And some of you will be familiar. You go to the GP for a health check, they'll tell you what your odds are for things like, and this one is, this is diabetes, I think you've used, isn't it? Yeah, so it says your personal risk is 4.2%. That means if there's 100 people like you, same lifestyle and everything, 4 out of 100 are likely to be diabetic. That's where it comes from. If we do that then for the hearing loss ones, so I said the revised one is 1.35. That means take 100 people without hearing loss, one of them will have dementia. You take 100 people with hearing loss, one and a little bit more will have dementia, 1.35. If we did it out of 1,000, you'd have 10 people without hearing loss, but everything else is the same, and 13 with hearing loss. So there is an increase. It's not huge, there is an increase, but it's gone down from the 1.9, completely unrelated to this 8 or 9% that you see published. That's talking about the people in the world. This is what's important to you and to me. So the word risk is interesting, because in everyday language we use risk. We say the heavy rain brings a risk of flooding, meaning the heavy rain could cause flooding, right? Cause. That's not the way it's used in epidemiological language. It means there's an association there. It doesn't mean it's caused it. So in epidemiological study, a risk means there's a marker, not necessarily a cause. So far, all I'm saying is hearing loss is a marker for dementia. 1.35. So it's higher than not having a hearing loss, but it's not as high as the previous studies that were saying it was 1.9. But it's still there, and it's real. And it's a marker for hearing loss. It doesn't mean hearing loss is the cause of dementia. I'm going to go through the evidence on that with you. So let's just talk about this modifiable risk, right? Modifiable is something we can change. So the example I've got there is our diet is a modifiable risk factor for type 2 diabetes, right? We change our diet, it could reduce and reverse diabetes. A potentially modifiable one is one that if we know that's what causes it, now we have the potential to correct that one. Hearing loss falls into that category, right? Hearing loss is a risk factor for dementia. We've just said that. It's a risk factor for dementia. If hearing loss causes dementia, then it's potentially modifiable, right? If we do something about hearing loss. If hearing loss causes dementia. Okay, so just to summarize that part, first thing we're talking about is our personal risk. That's what people want to hear. And when we talk about the 8 or 9% risk, the highest modifiable risk factor, the highest potentially modifiable risk factor, that's not talking about the risk to you or me. If we've got someone in front of us, they're interested in, but what's my personal risk? At the population level, that's where the 8 or 9% comes from. But actually, although we won't have time to cover it today, that number is somewhat problematic. When you look at how it was calculated, I think there's lots of uncertainty about that number. If I was a betting man, I wouldn't be putting money on that number being correct. Actually, part of the problem with it is the 9% came from what was a personal risk, and then it gets added up to what happens across the world. That was based on 1.9. If we're down at 1.35, that 9% has already gone down to about 4%. That's assuming everyone can be avoided from having a hearing loss. We know that's not possible, right? We know that something like 1 in 3 people get a hearing aid. So that 4% has gone down to 1.5%, and we know that everyone with a hearing aid doesn't always wear it. Anyway, I'm going to put the population one to one side because too much time has been spent and misinformation on that part. So the personal risk from an epidemiological point of view is that there's an association, but it can only modify the risk if it actually causes dementia. So we need to look at the evidence. Does hearing loss actually cause dementia or cognitive decline? Okay, so we'll move on to the next point, second point, and that is looking at the correlation or the relationship or the association, we mean the same thing here, between hearing loss and cognitive decline or dementia. So we go from normal cognition to a declining cognition. It's going to happen to most of us. Then we can have impaired cognition, and then it can be dementia. It can take a long time to go from normal cognition to dementia. So studies often look at the rate of decline or the impairment as a marker for, if we had 20 years to do this study, this is where it would have ended up. Okay, so let's look at that one. Well, we've known for a long time, more than 100 years, from Francis Galton, that there is a relationship. The more sensory deprivation or decline you have, the poorer, on average, on group data, the poorer your cognitive ability on group data, right? So we're thinking of averages. So just going back to the point that was made in the start of this afternoon. Testicles. The average, the people in this room, the average number of testicles that people in this room have is 1, right? Because we've got half male and half female. You tend to have 2 or none. You put them together, you end up with 1. So you have to be careful when you even say average. Well, 50% will be higher than average, and 50% will be lower. Anyway, let's not get too distracted. So it's absolutely clear, and has been for a very, it's not new, sensory deprivation is associated with a cognitive decline. We absolutely know that for a very long time. And there have been lots of studies. Here's a big German one from the 1960s. In each of these graphs along the bottom, it's looking at age. As you move along to the right, you're getting older. And then on the vertical axis, on the first one is the cognition one. You'll see as you get older, your cognitive ability goes down. And then there's one for vision and there's one for hearing. And as you get older, they go down too. So age is a big factor. Age is a big factor for linking these things. But actually, there's an independent component. So you take age out of it, and there's still an association between hearing loss or vision loss and cognitive decline. So it's not just to do with age. A lot of it is, but it's not just to do with age. And here's a more recent study looking at dementia. So again, this is a study that took people at the beginning who didn't have dementia. They follow them along. So the time is moving along from the baseline, the start of the study. And I've put an arrow pointing at the line as it goes up. Sorry, not age, hearing loss now. And you'll see as the severity of hearing loss increases, the chances of having dementia increases. So we know that there's an association, and we know there's a dose response. The more hearing loss you have, the more vision loss you have. In fact, the more dual impairment you have, the higher the risk factor. Doesn't mean it causes it, but the higher the risk factor. And there have been a number of studies that have reviewed, a number of systematic reviews that have looked at all the studies that have tried to measure it. And this is the most recent one that I'm aware of. This is the U one that changed the personal risk to the 1.35. They had lots of studies, about 50, whereas the Lancet articles had something like 3, I think it was, that they had in it. So you take this one, and they're the ones that said, and this is just published this year, very recently, just a few months ago, no dementia at baseline. They followed people up for 2 years. Hearing loss was categorized, yes or no, have you got hearing loss? And the hazard ratio is the 1.35, right? That's where we said 1 in 100 without hearing loss, dementia, 1.35 people out of 100 that have hearing loss will have dementia. So it is absolutely clear that there's an association there. It is absolutely, there's no doubt about it, and there hasn't been any doubt for decades and decades and decades. There's nothing new about that. So what I want to move on to is, what does it cause it, right? Because when you read the literature, Almost every article. We were looking at reports this morning. Both of the reports mentioned dementia very early on in the report. Last night, I looked at the most recent article that's appeared online from the International Journal of Audiology. The article's not about dementia. The first sentence says how important hearing loss is, and the second sentence says hearing loss and dementia. Hearing aids may reduce the decline in cognitive ability and may remove the excess risk of dementia. I've slightly paraphrased, I can't remember it exactly, right? Almost every article says it. It's almost as if we're ashamed and we think, hearing loss isn't really important, is it? We're going to piggyback on dementia because people will sit up and take notice. Of course, if it's never shown that hearing loss causes dementia, everyone who's watching us right now will totally lose interest in hearing loss. Will totally lose interest in hearing loss. Okay, so let's look at the evidence for causality. I want to take you through some slides. Here's one. Did you know that the divorce rate correlates with margarine consumption? There's the evidence. There's the evidence. Look at the graph on the left. There's years. And look at the lines going down. One is divorce rate going down. The other one is margarine consumption. So, what are we saying here? Eat a lot of margarine, you're going to get divorced? Put that margarine back in the fridge, because if you have any more of that, right? Is that what we're saying? And there's how you look at it in terms of a correlation here. Sorry, I'm at this end, it's a bit far apart. Divorce rate along the bottom, margarine consumption up the side. You can see the line, right? We don't jump to conclusions, do we? We don't say, stop, go easy on the margarine, or your marriage isn't going to survive. So the question here is, well, what's going on? Is that a real correlation, or is it spurious? You can go to the website I listed in the previous slide. You'll get hundreds of examples of these. You don't need me to convince you, right? This is a spurious finding. I mean, it's completely nutty and daft, isn't it? There's lots of these examples. So in this case, we can say there's a correlation, but we're not saying one causes the other. So that one's quite easy to dismiss. Correlation doesn't mean one's caused the other. Because hearing loss is correlated with dementia, it doesn't necessarily mean that hearing loss causes dementia, right? Here's another one. Sales of ice cream. As the sales of ice cream go up, the sales of sunglasses go up. What happens here? We go to the freezer to get our ice cream and think, oh, we better suddenly put our sunglasses on or buy another pair. That doesn't make sense, does it? There's probably something in common that's responsible for both of these, right? Summer comes along, weather gets warmer, we wear our shorts, we could have put increased sales of shorts up there. We have ice cream and we have sunglasses. So this time, what we can say is, and there's ways of verifying it, that's a real relationship, right? That's not a BAMI one. Every study that looks at it will get the same finding. As the weather heats up, they both go in the same direction. So we're saying something independent caused it. In the same way, if we say there's a correlation between hearing loss and cognitive decline, that's not spurious, that is absolutely real. I've shown you the evidence on errors, it is absolutely real. But one explanation is there's something in common that causes a hearing loss and cognitive decline and that also causes dementia. That's a possibility. I'm going to come on to it, right? Okay, so correlation is not causation. It's a logical fallacy. It happens to all of us. Because things co-occur, we think one must cause the other, right? Just a logical fallacy, but it's not correct. So anytime you see correlations and something on one axis and the other and a line going up or coming down, they're absolutely related, but it doesn't mean that one causes the other. It could be spurious, it could be the margarine and divorce thing, it could be there's an independent factor, or maybe it does. Maybe the one thing does cause the other thing. Here's one. Physical exercise and calories expended. That's not spurious, is it? We just know, without having to delve any more into it, that is not spurious. And is it something separate that causes it? No, you're using up your energy as you do the exercise. So this is one where we can say absolutely it's the exercise that's responsible for us using up our calories. So there's lots of combinations, right? Could be spurious, could be something completely separate. Maybe one of them does cause the other one. Just keep that in mind anytime someone's talking about correlation or associations or relationship. What about hearing loss then? Let's come back to why we're here today. Is it real or is it spurious, the correlation between hearing loss and cognitive decline? It absolutely is real. It absolutely is real. The question is, does one cause the other? Does the cognitive decline lead to hearing loss? Does the hearing loss lead to cognitive decline? Could go either way. Or is there something separate that's happening in our brain that means they're both going to happen and we can't influence it? It's quite an important question, right? Because if we are able to say it's the hearing loss that causes it, then we think, well, there's something we potentially could do. It's a modifiable risk factor. Okay, so here's the possible mechanisms. The first one is they're related because it's a bit like the summer weather. There's a common cause. And a possibility is that the graphic is of the brain and it's saying, oh, it could be vascular disease. The vascular disease, limited nutrients, getting to your inner ear, could be responsible for hearing loss or age-related hearing loss. Vascular problems could also be responsible for other health conditions, including cognitive decline. So there's something that could be testable. We could test it to say, is there something in common that explains these two things? Here are a list of factors that are common to hearing loss and cognitive decline. Exercise. If you don't exercise, I mean, if you're unhealthy. Diet, smoking, alcohol, early life experiences, inflammation. So it's quite possible it could be poor lifestyle, means you're going to end up with a hearing loss, or it increases your risk of a hearing loss, and it increases your risk of cognitive decline, right? There's lots of things that are in common between them. Another mechanism, though, is it really the hearing loss that drives the cognitive decline? Is it because we've got this impoverished signal, sounds aren't audible, or it's so distorted, it damages our brain? Is it so impoverished that it damages our brain? If you don't use it, you lose it. Okay, so that's a possibility. If that was correct, then when we give someone a hearing aid, it can't reverse the damage it's done, but if they're getting hearing aids early enough, or the intervention, it could potentially reduce the risk of dementia if you do it early enough. So if hearing loss caused it, and it was because the signal is so impoverished, no stimulation. Here's another one. It's not the impoverished signal on its own that's the problem. It's the fact that our brain has to work harder and put a lot more effort in. And everyone says that with a hearing loss, right? That's why people say, I give up, because it's so hard. I have to put a lot of effort in to listen. And that's your way of trying to compensate. Use your cognitive resources, because you've got a hearing loss, so you're using all your cognitive resources, or not necessarily all of them, but we have a limited pool, right? It's not infinite, the pool of resources in our head. So we have this limited pool of resources in our head, and this theory goes that we're using all our cognitive resources. And a bit like at the beginning when I said, you got to train to run a marathon. If you're taking the stuff that you need to survive the marathon, then it's not available for you, right? You won't get across the finishing line. So that could be an explanation. They're not independent, I should say. Could be not mutually exclusive would be the term. So in this case, if a hearing aid meant you didn't need to use your cognitive resources, your attention and your memory so much, then potentially it could improve your cognitive ability. And dementia risk, maybe if you catch it early enough, so that you're not using all these resources to help with your hearing. I think what is clear is that hearing loss makes, for most people, listening easier, right? It doesn't solve the problem. Give people a hearing aid in a quiet clinic room and they're dead impressed, and then you put them out in the noise and they soon realize, actually, where I have the problem, I've still got a problem. But I think for most people, there's evidence that it helps, it reduces your reliance on all your cognitive abilities if you can hear better. If you can't, people will tell you, I have real problems with my memory because I'm so busy listening, I've kind of forgotten what they just said. Evidence from the 60s that happens. So I think it would be fair to say hearing better helps us think better, but that's not to do with dementia, right? But I think there's a link there to do with our cognitive ability. Sorry, let me just go back and see what... yeah, we've already covered them. Okay. And there's another mechanism, and that is the hearing loss leads to anxiety and stress, social isolation. We're not going to start mixing so much, and that social withdrawal could lead to impoverished stimulation. So it could be, it was the hearing loss, but not directly, indirectly because of these other factors. And of course we know that, don't we? People with hearing loss will say, oh, I'm not going out because it's too noisy, I can't hear what they say, and there's, people become socially withdrawn. So there are a variety of mechanisms, and they're not mutually exclusive. It could be there's a common cause, like vascular problem, one example. Maybe hearing loss does cause dementia, either because our brain's not being stimulated, so you don't use it, you lose it, or our brains have to work really hard and use all our resources just to listen to what's being said, or maybe it's the side effect, the indirect consequences of the isolation and the lack of social stimulation that can come along. Now, here's somebody who's very famous, Austin Bradford Hill. He's famous because with his colleague Richard Dahl, they were the ones that showed the correlation between smoking and lung cancer. Not just the correlation, they were the people who were able to demonstrate that it's smoking that leads to lung cancer. Not in everyone, but we now know, right? We all accept it. It's kind of beyond doubt now. He was also the first person to publish what's called a randomized controlled trial, where you take people and half of them you give them the intervention that you think might work, and the other half get a control. He did it, antibiotics for TB, and it was published in the British Medical Journal in 1948, the year the NHS started. So very important man. And he said, look, if we haven't got a randomized controlled trial, but we observe we've got this pattern, what could help us decide, is it the hearing loss that's causing the cognitive decline? And he has a list of factors, and I've just got some of them here. And some authors have argued these demonstrate the likelihood that hearing loss causes dementia. So a dose-response relationship. It's absolutely true. The more hearing loss, the higher the risk of cognitive decline or dementia. It's absolutely true. The temporality, meaning one happens and then the next one comes along. You get a hearing loss and somewhat later down the road, you have cognitive decline or dementia. They're saying that order is telling you the hearing loss comes first. And then the third thing they've got up there is consistency across studies. Well, we have consistency. There's absolutely no doubt that there's an association between hearing loss and dementia. But I just want to pause and suggest, just because you get that pattern, it still doesn't mean that hearing loss causes dementia. Because here's a study that's just been published looking at neurovascular coupling. Just think of blood supply and nutrients to the brain. And it reports that the small capillaries in the inner ear are affected first, and then later on, the vascular problem affects other parts of the brain. Hearing loss first, then dementia. We're not saying the hearing loss caused dementia, right? So we still, unless we have a randomized controlled trial, which is a bit unethical to say, you guys have all got hearing loss, and we're going to help you guys, but we're just going to watch you guys and do nothing. It's very hard to get ethics approval to do these sorts of things. So here is a summary. It's beyond doubt that hearing loss is a marker of brain health, and it's associated with dementia. But it's a bit like saying your ear is like a window into your brain. When things start to go wrong with your ear, that's telling us things might be going wrong with your brain. Same with your vision. You could think of it like that. It's like the canary down a mine. It's just giving you the early sign that something's not right. It's not necessarily that the hearing loss is causing the dementia. So every time you read a report or you see a publication, just stop and ask yourself that question. The mechanisms are unknown that link our cochlear peripheral hearing to cortical degeneration. So we don't know if hearing loss causes dementia because we don't know how the two are linked. Despite the fact almost every publication nowadays says, listen, pay attention to hearing loss because it's kind of an important, but it can lead to dementia. We're going to scare the life out of you. That's the potential message that people are hearing. Every time we have a publication or report, and we keep saying this link between hearing loss and dementia. And then the final thing I want to mention is to summarize the current evidence on benefits of intervention, hearing aids. Because if hearing loss causes dementia or cognitive decline, if you can minimize the effect of hearing loss, you might be able to see a reduction in the decline over time if you compare two groups. And here's a review done by one of my colleagues, Piers Dawes, and others, where he looked at all the articles that looked at hearing devices. So there haven't been any studies published that have used a non-device trial looking at therapy and improving communication skills. But they separated them into studies that looked at cochlear implants. Now, if we start with that, most people that get a cochlear implant go from hearing nothing to hearing something that's like black and white, right? Look how great, how impressive is what Jodie does. So you'd think, well, there's a big jump. So if any device is likely to show a difference, we should probably start with cochlear implants. And actually, if you look at the evidence, the 3 studies in cochlear implants said there was an improvement in cognition. The problem is there are not many studies, they're small numbers, and methodologically they're quite weak because they're not like a randomized trial. But anyway, it's pointing in the direction that might make us sit up and take notice. And then they looked at the hearing aid ones. They looked at changes in cognition. Was it slower in the group that got the hearing aids? And cognitive impairment, was it bigger in the group that got hearing aids? Actually, you'll see that there are 8 studies that say it seemed to reduce the decline. Then there's another 8 studies that say we didn't see a difference at all. So it's absolutely far from conclusive right now. And the important point is, just because a study's been done doesn't mean it's of good quality, right? And I'm not criticizing necessarily the authors. There are poor studies published, but it's the nature of the design. If you can't randomize and do all the good things that a trial would need, then you can never be quite sure. We compared these people that decided they wanted a hearing aid with these people who, for some reason, didn't go for a hearing aid. Already there's something different between the two groups, right? It's not just this group's got a hearing aid, something motivated them. Maybe they've got better education. Maybe they're already got more cognitive decline to start with. That's the problem with all of these observational studies. So here's one that I wanted to highlight, because from time to time, the media is full of these reports about the association between hearing loss and cognitive decline, and apologies, and saying that, it looks like the hearing loss causes it. So here was a study that was published last year. It used a big body of work from something called the UK Biobank. You might have been invited to join. It's quite old now. 500,000 people were asked to turn up, got some blood tests, hearing tests, whatever. They went back and they looked at the data that was recorded, and they compared people with a hearing loss with people who were in this trial who didn't have a hearing loss, and the ones who had hearing aids and the ones who didn't. So the first point says, compared to the people with no hearing loss, the people with a hearing loss who didn't use hearing aids had an increased risk of 1.42. Okay, we understand that, don't we? We said, if you don't have a hearing loss, it'll be 1 person 100. 1.42 means it'll be 1.42 people 100. So the risk was higher. And then they said, but here's the really interesting bit. Compared to the people who don't have a hearing loss, the ones who used hearing aids, we got a value of 1, or almost 1, 1.04. So their interpretation was, wearing hearing aids has prevented this cognitive decline. And there was a big fanfare. There were accompanying editorials. There was lots of reporting of this on BBC News, CNN, and this is from The Lancet, one of the top medical journals, right? That we would tend to trust because we think, wow, you have to be good to get into The Lancet. Here's a couple of the editorials. Preventing dementia through correcting hearing, huge progress. Addressing hearing loss at all ages. So we're sitting up here thinking, this is fantastic news. This is fantastic news, because it ain't nice having dementia, right? We probably all have elderly parents and are completely taxed by this. But wait a minute. There was a guy, a researcher in Edinburgh, who was working in this area, and he thought, I just want to make sure I'm using my software and my script right. I better just check that I can get the same result as this paper that was published. And he tried, and he couldn't get the same findings. And he thought, I don't know what I've done wrong here. And he tried, and he tried, and he tried. Then he said, you know what? It's not me that's wrong. It's this paper that was published in The Lancet. So he wrote to the authors, and he didn't get a response. And he wrote again, and he didn't get a response. You should take a photograph of this slide and Google it. And he explains what he had to do before someone would sit up and take notice. Then he contacted the editors of The Lancet. Didn't get much response. And eventually, so he started this like last March, April time. In December last year, The Lancet published these, retracted, very quietly. You probably didn't even hear it being mentioned. And the bottom one, retracted. So they liked the newsworthy story. They thought the science was good. When this researcher says they've made a mistake, there was no fanfare then. Damage is done. The world has been told already. Wear a hearing aid, it removes the risk. What he discovered is it muddled up the groups. The people who wore the hearing aids were the ones that had more of a problem. Complete opposite. Why can that be, you're thinking? That doesn't make sense. It does make sense. The people who wear hearing aids have more severe hearing loss. And we've said there's a dose response. The more severe the hearing loss, the more likely you're going to have cognitive decline. That is probably the answer. I don't know, but it's probably the answer. We wrote to the editor, they wouldn't publish a letter from us, to say, if you think the science was good there, you should get the authors to submit again with the new interpretation so people are aware, so they don't always get this jaundiced view of headline one, The Lancet. The Lancet of all journal articles. What about looking at these randomized trials where we muddle you up and some get interventions and some don't? There are not many at all. There's one in Australia, I don't think it's reported yet. The only randomized controlled trial I know of is the one at the bottom there that you might have heard of called the Achieve study, because it got masses of publicity. Now, to be fair, this is a really comprehensive trial. It's understandable that no one else has been able to do it. It's huge scale, the potential impact, the rigor they put into it. Look, almost 1,000 people randomized to getting a hearing intervention or a control, and their primary outcome measure was to look at a global measure of cognition after 2 years or 3 years, after 3 years. You could argue you need to wait longer than 3 years, and it's ongoing, but that was our primary measure. What did they find? If you look at the graph, that's time running along the bottom axis. So if there was no change, you'd have the dotted line along the top. But you'll see there's two lines, both groups. The ones with the hearing intervention, the ones without, they're both going down because people are getting older, right? You measure us over time, it's going to creep down. But there's no difference between the two groups. Their primary measure was, is there a reduction in cognitive decline in the group that got the hearing intervention? And the conclusion is, there's no difference between them. Except they went a step further and said, well, actually, when we dig around and we take a subgroup out and we look at it, there is a difference. Actually, I think that's debatable because it wasn't the primary outcome. The study might have been underpowered. When I look at something called the effect size, I think it was 0.25. That's a small effect size. Difficult to know if someone can replicate it. They might be able to. So I don't want to rule out altogether. But the primary finding, but you wouldn't know it if you were reading any of the literature, the reports we saw this morning, these articles that are appearing in audiology magazines. So the point I'm making is, if hearing loss does cause dementia, we haven't found the evidence for it yet. There's plenty of evidence about the association, plenty of evidence about the association. It is absolutely not convincing that it's the hearing loss that causes cognitive decline and that hearing interventions can minimize it. So, what are the 4 take-home messages from the presentation? It's not quite the last slide. There's a couple of take-home slides I've got, but what are the 4 here? The first point is there's consistent evidence of an association. Just accept it. Look at some of the publications I've got on the slides, these systematic reviews. There is good evidence that they are related. The second point, current estimates of individual risk of dementia from hearing loss is less than the risk for obesity, smoking, depression, inactivity, diabetes. you don't necessarily see all these things listed in the paper. You'll see hearing loss mentioned. Hearing loss is a lower risk than these other things. So I'm not saying it's not a risk. It is a risk. It's not the highest risk, and we don't know if it causes it. Third point, we do not know if hearing loss causes dementia because we don't yet understand the mechanism between why do you get hearing loss or vision loss, sensory decline, why do you get cognitive decline. And although there are low-quality studies that suggest that hearing aids might reduce the risk, there aren't any high-quality studies, apart from the ACHIEVE, the randomized controlled trial that showed that there was a small reduction in cognitive decline as people got older over the 3 years, but the rate of decline was the same for the hearing aid group as the group who didn't get hearing aids. So, what should you do and what shouldn't you do? I think the first thing is, don't go down a rabbit hole, right? Because it's going to be very hard to climb out of this rabbit hole, and it'll be very hard to get the attention of policymakers if we convince them, oh yeah, hearing loss and cognitive decline and dementia, and then they realise in a year or two, I mean, we'll find out, won't we? If we're fortunate enough to live long enough, we'll get the answer to this question. So you don't have to take my word for it. We'll get the answer. But don't expect them still to be interested in hearing loss if we convince them the only reason hearing is important is because of the link with cognitive decline. I think we should all carry on raising awareness about the importance of healthy hearing. These will be some of the points that I mentioned this morning. Hearing loss is important in its own right? We know that. Hearing loss is important. Healthy hearing is important. If you rank things, people like ranking them, hearing loss ranks third in terms of all conditions with years lived with a disability, because there's a lot of people with hearing loss and they live a long time with it. It's first for sensory. Hearing is top of the pile there. It's first if you're over age 70 and it impacts quality of life. There are proven benefits of hearing interventions. We know that, right? These are the things we need to emphasize. We know, first of all, that it's important for communication and social interaction. That's probably the number one thing we'd always get a hearing aid to help you with communication, right? But it isn't just that. And I think the next bit is equally important when we're speaking to people outside our immediate sphere. That, okay, it is very important for communication and social interaction, but there are proven benefits of hearing aids to facilitate well-being and having an active, an engaged, an independent, a healthier, older life. These are all genuine things where there's strong evidence, and we can be repeating that to policymakers regularly. So we need to avoid negative messaging for a variety of reasons. I've emphasised policymakers, if it's not shown to be true, will get totally fed up with us. There's lots of evidence from health psychology that negative messaging puts people off. Send to someone, you've got a hearing loss, and you better get it treated because you might end up with dementia. Nobody wants to think they'll get dementia. Think, well, I don't want to go and get a hearing aid. I want to associate with them. In the same way that cigarettes say, you know, they kill you. Look at the trouble. Look at this picture of a lung. Doesn't stop people, right? The government a number of years ago decided they wanted to reduce the number of teenage pregnancies. So they gave teenage girls little dolls that would cry during the night and wet themselves. And they said, we're going to scare them. This will put them off. Do you know what happened? Teenage pregnancies increased. So you have to be very careful about how the messaging comes out. They obviously thought this poor thing, and they started taking an interest in it, and then they started having more babies. It wasn't a huge increase, but it went up, it didn't go down. So negative messaging doesn't work. There are lots of examples where the government thinks, I'm going to say something nasty and someone will change their behavior. It doesn't work. Top tips. So if someone said to you, well, what should I do? Then these are the things. We should all be eating healthily. We shouldn't be obese. We want to avoid diabetes. We want to keep fit. We don't smoke tobacco because the risk there could, let's just don't, we're running out of time. Drink alcohol in moderation. There's actually some evidence that a little bit of red wine is good for your hearing. So I'm not suggesting take away the hearing aid, we'll give you a bottle of red wine. But in terms of vascular supply, a little bit of alcohol can be good in moderation and maintain a good social contact. So you should speak out when you see this potential misinformation. Here's a website, talks about a hearing number, average audiogram. At the bottom of that page, designed for the public, the bottom of the page says, number 1, the single greatest risk factor for dementia. I said to my dad, what does that mean? He has a bit of cognitive decline and he's very deaf as well. So we had this discussion and he said, oh, right, so my hearing, So I need to look after my ears because my hearing loss is what's causing cognitive decline. That's what the public take away from these sorts of things, right? Hearing loss isn't the greatest personal risk factor. A risk means a correlation, not necessarily a causation, and the evidence that hearing aids reduce risk is mostly low quality and not convincing, right? So we have to be very careful how we use these words. So if you see it, don't just go along with it. Take the opportunity to correct it in a nice, polite, and friendly way. And finally, this is the point I made this morning. People who enter older life in good health have a much more positive experience than people who enter old age with multiple health conditions. A hearing loss is a chronic long-term condition, right? It breaks down the barriers with communicating with each other and cutting us off. So maintaining and improving our healthy hearing is vital. It's a strong social responsibility, and that's why we should be getting these facts right until we know differently and concentrate on this is what happens when you have a hearing loss, and here are the things that we can do to help you. Just want to thank Piers, who's done a lot of the work that I've just spoken about today, and also the support I've had from this thing called the Biomedical Research Centre. Thank you.
Goodness me. Am I on? Lovely. Oh, Kevin, thank you so, so much. Not just for your keynote speech, but also for being an amazing panel chair this morning. We really appreciate that. You were fantastic.
Thank you.
Professor Kevin Munro, everybody.